sacrificed my dream career to work at the family store. But when I finally asked for a share of ownership, my parents told me the business was already promised to my cousin, who rarely helped and spent most days sleeping without any regret. I'm 22F Marin, and up until a short time ago, I thought I had my path mapped out. I grew up in a small town in northern Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where families hold on tight to traditions whether or not they're practical. My parents, Corinne and Elias, have run a small family convenience store since I was born. They began with almost nothing and built it up to be successful, and I envied that, but I always vowed I would never end up stuck there. I had big dreams in high school of being a physical therapist, and I stuck it out for it. I was accepted into a state school several hours away, and even started the program, but my sophomore year my parents financially struggled. The store wasn't doing well because a bigger chain store opened up in town, and they were flooded. They told me that they needed help. At first, I would just come in on weekends, shuffling shelves, operating the cash register, and making deliveries. But before long, it escalated to me taking entire semesters off school in order to keep the store afloat. They repeatedly assured me that it was only temporary, that when things did stabilize, I could return and complete my degree. But the years slipped into months, and soon I ended up dropping out altogether. I reminded myself that I was giving up for family. It would pay off in the end, but in my mind, this seething was present with each passing thought of what I was giving up. My friends were graduating, starting careers, moving to cities, and I was working behind the counter selling cigarettes and lottery tickets to the same people whom I had known since middle school. I did not allow myself to resent it. I reminded myself this was loyalty. Family came first, and they kept telling me someday the store would be mine as well. Life at the store became a routine. I woke up at 6, opened the shutters, swept the floors, counted the cash drawer, and spent the day ringing people up while my parents did orders and paperwork. My 19-year-old little brother, Callum, was also planning to help out, but he's never been the most reliable guy. He says he's at community college, but 3 times out of 10 he's sound asleep in his room or hanging out with friends. And my other cousin, Nolan, who's 24 and technically part of the store team according to my parents. But if you saw how often he ever actually showed up, you'd be crying tears of hilarity. He appears about lunchtime maybe 2 times per week, states he is tired, grabs something from the deli counter without paying for it, and then departs. He spends most of his time in bed at his mother's or roaming around with his friends on road trips. My aunt, his mother, still excuses it, saying things like, "Nolan just needs to be guided," or "he's lazy because he's depressed." Maybe so, but it doesn't alter that I'm the one working 12-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week. I choked down frustration for years, thinking that everything would balance out in the end. I had thought that the moment my parents would be willing to step aside, they'd hand over the reins to me as I had earned it. Then about 3 months prior, at last, I thought it was time to bring up the matter. I sat them down one night after the shop closed. I remember I was sweating, exhausted, and nervous, but I'd rehearsed what I had to tell them. I explained to them I'd abandoned school, I'd set my life aside, I'd worked harder than anyone else, and I wanted an honest share of ownership in the store. Not promises, but real documentation with my name on it. So I knew the sacrifices I'd made weren't in vain. I was expecting maybe some hesitation, maybe even some haggling of percentages, but no, they just glared at each other in this odd, guilty way. And my mom said, "Marin, we already committed the business to Nolan." I thought I heard something amiss. I actually laughed because it was so absurd. I said, "What do you mean committed to Nolan? He doesn't even work here anymore." My dad would not even look at me. He said it was decided years and years ago because I was the only son on my mother's side of the family, and Nolan's father had died young, so they wanted to make sure he'd be settled. I'd been hit like a punch in the gut. Settled? What about me? I was the one working day and night. It was me who'd given up my degree, my future, my life, and they'd planned all along to award it to someone who couldn't be bothered to arrive in time. I remember sitting there staring at them and, for the first time ever, feeling like a stranger to my own family. I had to scream, throw something, make them turn it around, but all that would come out was, so all of this was for nothing? My mother's eyes filled up, but then she said softly, "No, it wasn't for nothing. You helped us get through." That was not what I wanted to hear. I wanted to be told that I mattered, that my future mattered, not that I was only useful until Nolan was done. That night, I didn't sleep much. I was in bed staring at the ceiling, my chest tight, wondering if I had wasted the last 4 years of my life. Things have been tense ever since. I just keep going to the store because I don't know what else I'm supposed to do. But with every glance my way, Nolan is sitting behind the counter like he owns the shop, and I feel ill. He brags about the future, speaking as though to say, "When it's my store, I'll redesign it," or "I'll employ others so I won't have to work every day." He utters it thoughtlessly, nearly as if not even realizing how much it angers me, as though he's already written me out of the story. My parents avoid the subject, but I feel the weight of it whenever we occupy the same space, and I just wonder, do I just continue working and hope they change their mind? minds? Or do I just leave and start living for myself at last? The issue is, I don't even know who I am anymore outside of that store. I didn't think that I could continue like that, but I had no other choice back then. Rent, bills, shopping, they all fell on me when I left school because my parents kept me in there fully dedicated to the store. Callum never paid in, and Nolan didn't. So if I was to walk out, the store could break down, and I'd be to blame for that too. I started to pay attention to little things that I'd overlooked before. How my parents would praise Nolan for just being present, even for 1 hour, and how he could fumble and they'd cover it up. I remember one evening, a Thursday evening at 7 p.m. Nolan arrived with his worn-out sneakers and faded jeans, smelling of cigarette smoke. He stood at the counter, messing around with his phone, and my father told him, "Good work today, Nolan. Appreciate you pitching in." I wanted to scream. I dropped the boxes I was carrying, and they clattered onto the floor with a thud, shaking everything, and I cried out, "I've already worked here 10 hours and you're calling him good?" My mom whispered, "Marin, don't make a scene," but I couldn't help it. I was betrayed, invisible, and angry all at once. I saw then that this wasn't about the store. It was about my whole life, the way I'd had to set aside my dreams for people who would never give me the credit that was due to me. I started writing at night in a diary, documenting every little irritation, every smile that was a put-down, every second that I was not noticed. It was the only place I could be honest with myself. To his credit, some of the tension was picked up by Callum eventually. He is 19, occasionally idle, but he does possess a conscience. One evening after work, he came up to me as I was tallying the day's take and said, "Marin, I don't get it. You've worked this joint for years. Why are they giving it to Nolan?" I almost wanted to hug him, scream, sob all at once. What I did was shake my head and say, "Because they never really considered me the owner. I'm just the helper. That's all I've ever been." Callum glared at me, like he just couldn't understand it, and I don't blame him. There hasn't ever been much he's had to give up. I thought over what I was going to do next. I started looking into online courses, small side ventures, anything that would let me find a bit of independence again. But everything sounded impossible when I had 12-hour workdays every day at the store waiting for me. There were nights I'd fall onto the couch in the back room after closing, my body screaming, and Nolan would be lying on the sofa with his phone swiping in front of him, stating he was exhausted, and I'd look at him, despising myself for even thinking this way, knowing my parents had always envisioned him as the heir. I couldn't help but consider leaving permanently, even if it meant burning bridges, because the more time I spent there, the more I felt myself dissolving. I had grown to miss my old friends, my classes, the all-night studying, the feeling of becoming my own person. All of that had been replaced by fluorescent lights, spilt coffee, and customers asking for cigarettes with an air of entitlement that I was too exhausted to cope with. One Saturday morning, I tried to cope with my parents again. I said, "Look, I can't keep doing this forever. I've given everything. I have to know that what I've done is worth something." My dad grunted and said, "Marin, you've been terrific, but Nolan is the future. He's the one we committed ourselves to." My mom added, "We realize it's hard, honey, but we made a family decision years ago. You'll still have a spot in the business. You'll always have employment here." That word, employment, hurt more than anything. I realized at that point that my parents had never intended on ever accepting me as an equal partner. They wanted to reward bloodline, not effort, and I wasn't their most prized bloodline. I left the meeting angry, frustrated, and exhausted. I went into my room, looked at the wall, and reflected upon the last 4 years. I recalled the nights spent sobbing over overdue work, the weekends lost to skipping my friends' birthdays, the mornings I had to roll out of bed and drag myself to the store, and I churned with a rage that would not let up. I had labored in a cage, and now they were handing the key to someone who hadn't even noticed the bars. Despite all this, I was able to have some kind of normal life. I started volunteering at a community clinic a few nights a week, just to be of service beyond the convenience store. The first patient I helped get healthy from an injury, the look of gratitude in their eyes reminded me what my life could have been like. I was reminded that I'd almost forgotten who I was outside the walls of the convenience store, but coming home was always a body blow. Each morning, the smell of old coffee, the sound of the register, and Nolan spreading out like he was the owner reminded me my parents' vow wasn't mine. There were wins, though, such as helping regulars find what they needed, chatting with individuals who liked to chat with me, but even those were sour. I remember that one Thursday, one of our regulars, Mrs. Hanley, came in and said to me, "Marin, you're the only reason I keep coming here." I smiled, thinking to myself, they'll never see me like you see me. I started dreaming about what it would be like to be gone for good. Maybe I'd clean out my locker and take off for a far-off city, start over and never look back. But there was a pull to the store as well. Mine and all but on paper. Each shelf I stocked, each delivery I made, each hour I worked, sweat from my brow covered that store. Could I simply up and leave? Then the awful thing occurred. A few weeks prior, Nolan had knocked over a case of soda in the back room by mistake. I raced over to clean it up and my dad told me, "Don't worry about it, Marin, he's just learning." I wanted to yell. I had been careful and precise, and nothing was ever simply learning when I had done something wrong. Each of my errors had been explicitly stated, each of my faux pas documented, but Nolan learned from it. I stared at him, and he just shrugged as if he hadn't noticed I was standing there, anger seething in my chest. That evening, I sat alone, attempting to write out my anger, and something hit me, something that filled me with horror. If I remained, I'd always be second best, always be overlooked, always settling for my own future for someone who didn't even care. I wanted to cry, but the tears would not come. I was tired, furious, and numb all at once. I considered telling my parents again that they had to change their minds, but what if they didn't? Undefined. What if this was it, that this was my life forever? Working at a store that was never going to be mine, watching somebody else live the life that I created for myself? I hated the feeling of being trapped, hated the helplessness, but most of all, I hated that I still loved them, still longed for their approval, still hoped they would one day understand me. I started noticing cracks in myself that I hadn't observed before. I was exhausted all the time in body and mind, and I knew I was developing this nervous habit of snapping at people for minor things. I was locking up the store late one evening, taking inventory, and my hands shook so hard that I dropped a box of canned goods. Nolan walked in at that moment, chewing gum and scrolling through his phone, and he didn't even look up. "Beware, Marin," I snapped, and the words burned in my throat because I knew that it was unfair. He shrugged and mumbled something about me being too straight-laced, and I felt my face flush with anger and shame. I tried to tell my parents how I felt, but I was just too tired to continue fighting anymore. I started keeping track closer of what I did, putting down hours, tasks, and duties in a log, trying to build an argument in my head as to why I was entitled to it, but it was exhausting, like repeatedly banging one's head against the wall without any impact. I couldn't help but think about what it would be like to walk away from it all, to finally take control of my life, but always hesitated because I did not want to be the bad kid and abandon family responsibilities. I lay awake each night, the neon glow of streetlights outside my window flicking across the ceiling, and questioned myself, am I doing the right thing? Is there another option? I did not have any solutions, but growing frustration. One day, my Uncle Henry, whom we live 2 towns away from, came into the store. He is the kind of uncle who always prefers to give advice but never actually helps. He watched me work for a couple of hours before finally saying, "Marin, you're killing yourself here, and for what? They've already promised it to Nolan. Don't seek appreciation, don't seek justice. You'll have to decide for yourself." I remember feeling both relieved and panicked. Finally, someone had said what I'd been thinking all along, but leaving my parents and the store, filled me with more terror than anything else. I felt as if I'd be abandoning them, even though rationally, they'd already abandoned me. I came home that night and sat quietly on the couch, allowing my mind to whirl. I pictured up and away and to a far-off city where I might find strange jobs, even finish school, build a life where my labor and effort were appreciated. But then my parents and the store popped into my head and guilt crushed me. I was so torn I didn't even know what to think anymore. Things boiled over a few days later when my mother asked me to cover a shift Nolan was supposed to work. He had indicated to me that he had something going on, but instead of covering for him, I went back in the back room and cried my eyes out. I just let everything that had been pent up inside of me for years come spilling out. I couldn't breathe, and my chest was aching as if I'd been punched. My dad came back to see what was all the commotion about, and all he said was, "We need you, Marin. He'll be okay." I stared at him in my mind, thinking, he'll be okay? What about me? I screamed at my parents later that night, informing them exactly what I thought, how I had risked my future for their sakes, and how it wasn't fair that Nolan, who hadn't contributed anything substantial, was going to receive everything. I had been anticipating an argument, so when they just shook their heads and sighed, repeating the same thing again and again, "We promised him," I felt this massive burden in my chest, realizing there was nothing I could do to make them realize sense. I was questioning my sense of duty, my love for them, my loyalty. It was betrayal by the ones who were supposed to be caring for me, and I loathed myself for having been hurt so badly. I started fantasizing about leaving the store and wandering down strange streets with nothing but a small backpack, and I'd wake up with my heart racing in my chest. I dreamt of being free for the first time in years, but waking came with the usual fluorescent lights, the stench of coffee and bleach, and Nolan reclining like he was the king of the castle. I began creating a list of all the things that I wanted to accomplish if I ever managed to escape, from receiving my degree to traveling to meeting new people who would not recognize me as the kid who works in the family store. But day after day, I returned to the same fluorescent-lit aisles, trapped in a life that I never had chosen. My identity was eroding, being supplanted by exhaustion, resentment, and an odd, simmering anger. I felt I had become a ghost in my own life. And then the breaking point occurred. Nolan invited a group of of friends to the store one evening when I was working alone closing. They consumed sodas, played loud music, and littered trash everywhere. I was amazed at how little he cared about the shop, about the work, or about me. When my dad finally came back at closing time, he did not scream at Nolan. He only shrugged and said, "Kids will be kids." I had this burst of rage that still frightens me today. I screamed at Nolan, at his friends, at my parents, at the whole unjust system that had put me in such a predicament. I wept for hours, spent, angry, and completely powerless all at once. I slept restlessly that night, but when I awoke, I had a strange feeling of clarity. I recognized that staying at the store, waiting for justice, was a trap that I had set for myself. My parents would never get better, and Nolan would never deserve what I had already earned. The longer I stayed there, the more I was losing myself. The next morning, I honestly started to think about leaving. I started surfing websites for small apartment leases in neighboring cities, reading job postings, pondering means of re-establishing a life I'd shelved years before. I was nervous, scared, and embarrassed, but I felt a spark of enthusiasm I hadn't felt in years. I could imagine waking up in a world where I was worth something for my own contribution, and not just as a placeholder until someone was worthy of the store. And yet with realizing that, I was still hesitant. To leave would be a statement, a public claim that I no longer fit into the family story, that I had finally chosen myself instead of them. I wrestled with the plan for days, walking the shop late at night, reliving every memory, every sacrifice, every lesson that was actually an insult. I was standing at the edge of something terrible, and for the first time in years, I had choices. I woke up the next morning feeling heavy, like all my options were lying on my chest. I simply stood there staring at the clock, amazed at the life I'd almost forgotten I wanted. I'd been so caught up trying to prove myself, sacrificing for a family that wouldn't acknowledge my work, that I hadn't even known what freedom felt like anymore. I poured a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and waited for the sun to rise over the deserted streets. That's when it came to me. I didn't need anyone's permission to live my life. I could go, and it wouldn't make me ungrateful or untrue. It would be because I loved myself enough to take back my future. I spent the morning filling a small bag with essentials, imagining the apartment I'd seen on the internet, the courses I might enroll in, and the position I might start to make me feel like I was in control of my own life. When I zipped the bag up, I felt this strange mix of fear and anticipation. Fear, for I had never broken my family's rules before, and excitement, for the first time in years, I was doing something just for me. I had no idea what came next, and that scared me, but it was liberating. That day at the store, I went through my usual rounds, counting inventory, cleaning shelves, restocking the cooler, except that I wasn't simply completing tasks. I was seeing everything in a different light. I saw all the time I had wasted mooning over Nolan, fretting over my parents' promises, worrying about the store that would never be mine to them. I found myself having spent so much time measuring myself against people who didn't want to take notice. When Nolan came belatedly, yawning, I could feel the old annoyance well up, but I released it. I didn't argue, I didn't shout, I didn't grovel for attention. I just got on with the work, feeling a small burden lift at each item I completed. My parents noticed the difference. My mom asked me if I was okay, and I softly said, "I'm fine. I just need to look after myself for a little while." She didn't say anything, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. It stung, but not as much as their past betrayals. For the first time in my life, I was doing something for me without guilt. By late afternoon, I formalized my decision. I told my parents that I was going away to a city several hours from where we live to pursue classes and work. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't request permission. I simply told him as fact. My dad tried to argue, saying the store needed me, but I stopped him short. I told them that I'd tried my best to assist them, and now it was time for me to make a life of my own. Nolan snorted, probably assuming that I was being dramatic, and Callum had this shocked look on his face, not knowing what to say. I didn't feel guilty for leaving Callum behind, because I knew this was something that I had to do. It wasn't about the store, it was about reclaiming my identity, my dreams, and my future. My mom didn't speak, and I felt that heavy, familiar burn of invisibility. But with this strange sense of relief, I wasn't asking for permission any longer. I didn't need it. The drive to my new city was like a dream. I was a combination of fear and exhilaration, fists gripping the steering wheel, my head replaying every argument, every injustice, every time I'd made a sacrifice for the store. I thought of the sacrifices, the years lost, and the times I'd spent trying to get people who didn't care to take notice of my effort. And still, against all of that, I had this pride inside. I survived. I had worked harder than anybody I knew, endured more than I ever thought possible, and now at last, I was selecting myself. I started to think about the apartment I had rented, to envision myself putting furniture in place, the little routines I would create, and the liberty I would enjoy. I recognized that even if I had been pushed aside, I was the stronger for it. My parents' decisions had hurt me, but hadn't killed me. me. For the first time, I was actually standing on the doorstep of something truly my own. Once inside, I lay down slowly, placing each item down carefully, as if claiming space in my life I'd never before held. I was with a strange feeling of solitude and liberty. I knew it was going to be hard to adapt, to get a job, to finish school, and to settle down from scratch, but I was ready. That night, I sat along the window of my tiny apartment, observing the city lights, and I silently cried for the years that were sacrificed. I cried quietly, but not in despair, more like a release, an acknowledgement of the pain, the anger, the disappointment, and then, gradually, I began to imagine what my life could be if I let go of all the bitterness, if I focused on everything that I could control, and if I quit comparing myself to those who had never truly seen me. I started plotting out my first steps, taking classes, finding part-time employment, and restoring a bit at a time the shattered confidence that had accumulated over the years. Weeks passed, and I began to fall into a routine. I started working in a small physical therapy practice, just cleaning and helping out, but it was a reminder of why I had ever dreamed this life into existence for myself in the first place. I began taking classes online, fitting them in around my work schedule, and I began to meet people who respected me for who I was, rather than for what I could do for someone else. I still thought about the store from time to time, and about Nolan sitting idle while I had done all the work, but that sense of betrayal went away. I had assertively taken control of my own life, and that made all the difference. My parents phoned on and off, and I kept the phone calls brief. I heard the disappointment in their voices, but I no longer felt guilty. I had learned that loyalty to oneself was just as good as loyalty to family, and for the first time in my life I was at peace. And occasionally, late at night, I still catch myself thinking about the store, about the years I lost, and about Nolan receiving something he didn't deserve. But now, those things don't hold power over me anymore. They are memories, lessons, and reminders of how strong I am when I don't allow others to define my worth. I have my own space, my own life, my own future. And as I lie in bed, exhausted from the day of labor and learning, I feel the quiet tingle of possibility. I am not the same girl who sacrificed all for everyone. I am Marin, 22F, and I am living for myself. I don't know exactly what the coming years hold, but this I do know. I have taken ownership of my story, and nothing, not even family betrayal, can ever be taken away from me. Undefined, I've discovered that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that decide who you actually are.